My name is Denise Bradley, and I am Programme Manager for Marginalisation within Corrymeela's community, and I will be hosting the webinar this morning. So today is the 25th of November, and this is International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women and Girls, an occasion for governments, international organisations and civil society to raise public awareness and marks the beginning of the 16 Days of Activism, a global campaign against gender-based violence, running until December the 10th, Human Rights Day. Global estimates published by the World Health Organization indicate around 1 in 3 women worldwide have experienced either physical or sexual violence from an intimate partner. Domestic and sexual violence is one of the most prolific forms of gender-based violence and injustice in Ireland, and it is deeply embedded. It is hidden behind closed doors, and it's also extremely traumatic for survivors and their children. Corrymeela recognise that domestic and sexual violence can affect anyone, irrespective of gender, sexual orientation, age, ethnicity, disability, and religion. And yet over 90% of violent psychological and physical violence is from male to female in intimate partner relationships. It is currently estimated around 1 in 4, and at least 1 in 4 women will experience domestic and sexual violence in Ireland, irrespective of their background, age or religion. And on average, the police service in Northern Ireland responds to a reported incidence of domestic violence every 17 minutes. And these reported incidents are really only the tip of the iceberg. The majority of incidents go unreported and often extremely hidden. Violence incidents have soared during our pandemic, and in Northern Ireland we have borne witness to the violent deaths of at least 11 women in the last 18 months. And in 2019, Northern Ireland was reported to have the highest rates of femicide, that is intentional murders for being female, in Western Europe. This is startling. And yet these statistics still only tell part of the story. We will probably never know the true numbers of lives lost. Many women die prematurely for secondary illnesses caused by repeated physical harms throughout their lives. Domestic and sexual violence also fragments survivors' mental health, and as a result, many women are lost to suicide, often trying to escape unbearable torture and psychological suffering in their homes. Faith communities, parishes and church congregations are not immune from this form of violence and abuse. Churches can often be a natural place for people to gather, particularly in times of crisis, and yet sadly research tells us that women with Christian beliefs are often prevented from speaking out about the oppression, abuse and violence they experience on a daily basis. Many churches and faith communities respond with compassion. However, many women can be reluctant and sometimes dissuaded from approaching specialist organisational supports, whereby they can access vital holistic support to recover, sometimes suspicious and maybe sometimes just simply misinformed about the work support services can offer. We must get better. Prior to working at Corrymeela, I led and managed services for survivors of domestic and sexual violence. Many of the survivors I was alongside were women of faith, and too often they shared disturbing stories of being controlled by husbands who would use the Bible to condone the physical and emotional and sexual abuse they suffered. Many also had been physically beaten into submission, and many shared testimony that the scripture that they so dearly loved and clung to for hope was used as nothing more than a weapon to be spiritually abused further. A research case study in Cumbria in 2017 reported that 1 in 4 women within church congregations were also experiencing domestic and sexual violence, and yet only 2 out of every 7 felt their church or faith community were adequately equipped to deal with disclosures Many reported never having heard a sermon preached or a prayer said that would recognise survivors or stand up to violence in the home. And this can have dangerous consequences. As a result of, women are more likely to remain in and return to unsafe relationships and environments, whether it's fear, shame, stigma, not being believed. They're often the barriers to never speaking out. Seed of Sequoia is a trauma-sensitive resource, and it will be available as a 68-week study course for all of those within faith communities and churches, and particularly in leadership. Corrymeela will facilitate the studies to support leaders within faith communities and churches to start to engage and examine studies and to respond with confidence to disclosures, and refer on to specialist services where necessary to make our churches and communities safer places for survivors of abuse and violence. The resource also wishes to target early intervention and prevention of violence through examining the deeper rooted gender discrimination and inequality, which will be done through exploring misconceptions and myths and language that can continue to minimise risk and compound shame and the stigma of survivors, and I suppose sustain the cyclical nature of domestic violence. No organisation has the capacity or specialism to operate in silo, and over the years it has been the multidisciplinary coordinated responses that have been most effective in tackling issues. Many faith leaders we spoke to often felt unequipped and unsupported to deal with disclosures, but also recognised the need for more training and to have safer spaces for them also to have deeper conversations. This morning, I'm delighted to introduce Colette Stewart, Chief Executive from ONUS. ONUS offers specialist training and consultancy services to businesses, churches and communities to support survivors of domestic and sexual violence. Colette, we are thoroughly looking forward to listening to the work that you deliver throughout Ireland, and I believe now into the UK. You are so very welcome, and it's a pleasure and an honour to have you amongst us this morning. Colette.
Hey, good morning all. As Denise said, my name is Colette Stewart, I'm the Chief Executive of ONUS, and firstly, I'm delighted to be part of this morning's event, and thank you to Denise. I feel very privileged to be invited. I'm going to commence my presentation with a brief introduction to ONUS and the work that we do, and then I'll talk to you all in a bit more detail about, in specifics, our Safe Place and Safe Church pathways. So ONUS, we are a social enterprise established in 2007, and we offer specialist training and consultancy services on domestic abuse. In 2010, we launched our Workplace Charter on domestic violence, a bespoke accreditation scheme that empowers organisations and communities to recognise and respond to anyone affected by domestic abuse. We believe that in order to create a society that is zero tolerance to domestic abuse, that prevention and early intervention work is crucial. We don't provide direct support services. We aim to raise awareness and build capacity to ensure that anyone affected by domestic abuse is directed to the support services available. Hence the name of our pathways, Pathways for Participation. Our range of pathways enable everyone to play their part, and we work with a diverse range of organisations, including businesses, community organisations, schools and churches. During this pandemic, we recognised the need more than ever to raise awareness of domestic abuse and the range of support services available for anyone whose home is not a safe place. We therefore transitioned all of our provision from the traditional face-to-face to online with great success, and this has enabled us to extend our reach and further develop our partnership working. The ONUS approach is a true partnership approach, and all of our pathways showcase true partnership working, and we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail towards the end of my presentation. But to set the scene, we're now going to play a short clip showcasing Safe Place and Safe Church, and it features our first ever church to become a safe place, who then progressed on to become an accredited safe church also.
Unfortunately, domestic violence is very common, with 1 in 4 women and 1 in 9 men experiencing domestic abuse at some stage during their lifetime. We want anyone affected by domestic violence or abuse to know that they are not alone, and that if their home is not a safe place for them to access the support needed, that there are a wide range of other safe places available. We believe in order to create a society that has zero tolerance to domestic violence and abuse, that prevention and early intervention work is crucial, and churches play a pivotal role in this. Our Safe Church pathway empowers churches to recognise and respond to anyone affected by domestic violence or abuse through the provision of our ONUS CPD certified training and safe place resources.
We are God-given mission to reach out to the vulnerable and the weak, especially those who have no voice. We are a safe church here at Antrim Methodist, and to help us in that task, we can direct people to Women's Aid who have the expertise and the skills to help them who come to us. And we pray that we can play a wider part in the campaign and raising awareness so we can stop and even end violence and abuse in any form.
Our accredited safe churches will provide a safe place for anyone affected by domestic violence or abuse to confidentially access information and support services available.
Okay, so I'm now going to talk to you a little bit more about our Safe Place and Safe Church pathways in more detail. So Safe Place is the first step on the ONUS pathways for participation, and the Safe Place logo can be seen here on the right. Safe Place is a very simple but very powerful awareness raising and signposting initiative. Safe Place was launched by ONUS on a regional basis in February 2011 and is supported by a wide variety of organisations. We believe that everyone has a part to play to support anyone affected by domestic abuse and to send a clear message to perpetrators that domestic abuse is always wrong, potentially criminal, and costs us all and will not be tolerated or accepted in our society. The Safe Place initiative does not involve providing direct support services to anyone living with domestic abuse. Instead, we aim to raise awareness and build capacity to ensure that anyone affected by domestic abuse is directed to the support services available. We currently have a network of over 1,600 organisations who have already adopted the Safe Place initiative. And these range from small local businesses like hairdressers, beauticians, through to larger organisations such as the Northern Health and Social Care Trust, Police Service Northern Ireland, and a wide range of councils who all hold the Platinum Safe Employer Award. And our full range of safe places can be viewed on the ONUS website. So what would you need to do as a safe place? Next slide, Jess. We ask that all Safe Place organisations sign up to the Safe Place Pledge, to never commit, condone or stay silent about domestic abuse, to acknowledge that domestic violence or abuse are problems that impact on everyone and that they're prepared to play their part to help and support anyone affected, and to provide a safe place for anyone affected by domestic violence or abuse to confidentially access information. To implement Safe Place, you're asked to simply attend a Safe Place awareness raising webinar, which is 1 hour in duration, and then complete a Safe Place registration form. Next slide, Jess. Once you're registered as a Safe Place, ONUS will send you a supply of Safe Place resources to display on your premises. You will receive a Safe Place certificate, a pack of posters, a window sticker, and a supply of Safe Place business cards with the contact details of support organisations. A supply of cards should be kept in an accessible location where they can easily and discreetly be accessed. If you're not sure where the best place would be, toilet facilities can be a very good place to start. We would also ask that you undertake refresher training every 3 years as a minimum. We want to highlight that Safe Place is not about giving advice or providing counselling. we don't anticipate people will even ask for information. It's about making the statement, we know that domestic abuse is in our community. We know it's causing harm. We think it's wrong, and we're prepared to play our part in getting that message out to those who need to hear it and help them access the support they need. If your home is not a safe place for you to access support, then there are other safe places that are. As individuals go about their daily lives, to work, to the shops, to the hairdressers, to the library, to school, to church, to the GP or chemists, to pick their children up from school, they will see this logo and the message will be reinforced. Next slide, Jessica. So why is safe place needed? Denise has already highlighted, unfortunately, domestic violence is very common. And police in Northern Ireland respond to an incident of domestic abuse on average every 17 minutes of every day. And 17% of calls to the PSNI are about domestic abuse. In 2020, there were 31,848 domestic incidents and 19,000 domestic crimes recorded in Northern Ireland. And I'm sure you've all seen in the news that there has been concern raised about the increase in domestic abuse crime due to the effects of the COVID-19 lockdowns. People affected by domestic abuse often found that restrictions made it much more difficult to access support or to leave an abusive situation. In research conducted by Women's Aid, 2/3 of survivors said their abusers had used coronavirus restrictions to further mistreat them, and 62% of survivors said the abuse they experienced had worsened in the past year. On average, 2 to 3 women a week in the UK are killed by a current or former partner, and on average 85 women a year. Between 2019 and 2020, there were 15,674 calls received by the 24 domestic and sexual abuse helpline. And of these, 89% of calls were from women and 11 were from men identifying as a direct victim of domestic violence. Next slide. So how do safe places make a difference? Every safe place makes a difference to their community. Domestic abuse can affect anyone, and people affected by domestic abuse can find it difficult to access support services for a variety of reasons. Having a wide range of safe places is important, as this helps to promote the zero tolerance to domestic violence message, as well as making sure that the information and support available can be accessed by the whole community. We would especially encourage churches to join up and become safe places, as churches are often a place where people feel comfortable to seek support, where they are at their most vulnerable. Joining Safe Place and encouraging people within the church to attend the training means that you will have the knowledge and resources to effectively signpost someone to support. Next slide. As a safe place, you will be expected to display the Safe Place logo, promote Safe Place resources, and signpost to appropriate services using the Safe Place card. To reiterate, you do not have to give advice or ask questions, just provide the information. Safe Place means that there is zero tolerance for perpetrators of domestic abuse. There's support available for their victims. And if displaying the logo is all that a church is able to do, it's still a very positive means of support. It tells victims that they can safely access support services, resources within the premises. Next slide. So what is the Safe Church Pathway? So for those interested in further training, there are 2 options of progression for churches from the Safe Place webinar. The Safe Church Pathway is an ideal progression route for churches and places of worship. Next slide. The Safe Church training enables churches to recognise and respond to domestic abuse both within their congregations and in the wider community. And the training covers spiritual and religious abuse in greater detail. And in line with all of our other pathways, the Safe Church training has also transitioned to online provision. And the church pathway is mainly aimed at clergy and those with a responsibility for safeguarding within the church. Next slide. The other training that would be suitable for churches is the Community Safe Place Advocate Award. And this training is open to any individual who would like to make a difference in their community. and work towards achieving a Safe Community Award for their area. This course is run as a workshop session with the Safe Place Coordinator, and everyone is welcome to attend, and there is no minimum commitment or skill level. I talked about ONUS and the partnership approach. ONUS are now working with a wide range of Safe Place partners to deliver training across all Ireland. Next slide, Jessica. Our Safe Place partners nominate individuals who are trained by ONUS to deliver the Safe Place webinar, and then they can deliver the training either within their wider organisation or to the wider community. We have a range of Safe Place partners that assist us to roll out Safe Place, our first pathway, and I'll share with you a few examples. So Women's Aid and Ballymena, Carrickfergus, Larne and Newton Abbey roll out Safe Place and also our Safe Skill pathway within their geographical remit. PSNI are currently rolling out Safe Place regionally and deliver a range of open sessions and targeted sessions to pharmacies at the minute. And we're delighted to have entered into Safe Place partnerships with the 4 core denominations to assist us to roll out Safe Place across all of their churches, all Ireland. And just some stats to share with you as well. We currently have 1,600 Safe Place organisations. To date, we have 210 churches that are safe places, of which 109 have also progressed on to become accredited safe churches. And through our Safe Place partnerships with our church leaders, we can ensure that all churches can become safe places. Now, we always have an ask, and we would ask that you all follow us on Facebook and Twitter and encourage churches to enrol on a forthcoming webinar. We are delighted to have a schedule agreed and available on our website, All Ireland at the moment, and all sessions are currently promoted via Eventbrite and on social media, so are very, very easy to share and encourage participation. And just a final thought to leave you all with. Nancy Mason Clark of No Place for Abuse. We teach and preach that the family is sacred. The family may be sacred, but sometimes it is not safe. So through our Safe Church and Safe Place pathways, churches can all play their part. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Colette. That was incredibly informative, and I'm forever struck by the continued passion and courage around the work of Women's Aid and ONUS and all the specialist services throughout Northern Ireland. I guess it has saved thousands upon thousands of lives, particularly women and children's lives over the last 40 years. So very often without the recognition. So thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
So the seeds that would eventually grow into this Seed of Sequoia project were planted during an ordinary car journey. As I drove, the late Glenn Jordan, who was then Corrymeela's programme manager for public theology, spoke about a Bible study he had facilitated the previous evening of our journey. And I guess Glenn was known as one of Ireland's finest theologians. And as he spoke about the Old Testament story of Hagar, he spoke with a gentleness and a wisdom. And I was captivated to how his theological insights about the biblical text offered me a new perspective, a new permission to explore the brutality of the issues it contained. I reflected on our conversation, I suppose, in light of my own experience, having supported survivors of abuse and violence. And what I was hearing in this story was something that could be shared to be deeply supportive and affirming, particularly when explored with a spirit of wisdom, love and compassion. So over the coming months, Glenn and I created a vision for what is now the Seed of Sequoia. The Seed of Sequoia is the longest living organism and largest living structure on our planet, and yet it has such tiny seeds. Often whilst enduring harsh exposure and fires, new spaces are cleared, and these tiny seeds can deeply root into freshly prepared earth. Over time, these seeds will grow into magnificent sheltering structures, and whilst depending on the growth of others, they will form and create vast communities of structures in which to survive and protect one another. And this was our vision, that we would see tiny seeds of a sacred and holy text clear new spaces for it to deeply root and grow into a theology of compassion. And I guess providing formidable shelters of love, kindness and hope to women, children, men harmed by violence and abuse that happens behind closed doors. The Bible studies were selected to explore the challenging and difficult issues through the lens of the marginalised woman. There are countless accounts of marginalisation throughout the Hebrew and New Testament. The studies include Vashti, Hagar, Bathsheba, and the woman who was nearly stoned, and they serve as prophetic voices to address the inequality, the trauma, and the suffering survivors of domestic violence continue to experience, and also to bring visibility to those of us who often feel powerless to simply bystand and do nothing. I am now delighted to introduce the remarkable Emily Rowley, previous Corrymeela public theology intern who worked alongside Glenn during the writing of the stories, and the wonderful Alex Wimberley, Corrymeela's now spiritual leader and author of the stunning prayers that's been included in the resource. Alex and Emily, it's a joy to have you amongst us this morning.
Oh, thank you, Denise. And may I say that I am regularly humbled by the brilliance of my colleagues and by the privilege of representing Corrymeela and its work and the work that's been produced. Rarely have I been so proud of or moved by a resource or an initiative as I am by this one, because it speaks to what Corrymeela wants to be about and what public theology can be, which is allowing faith communities to connect and to know that there are resources in the social services that they can avail to help their congregations and their families, but also to help people who didn't know that theology was anything but what would divide us or cause great harm or silence voices. Our idea with public theology is that faith can still lead us into an inclusive practice of engaging, listening, challenging, changing, and collaborating towards a more cohesive and hope-filled society for everyone, in part because we can use scripture to open and extend conversations, not to end them. And so it is just an absolute delight to be able to introduce to a wider audience the brilliance of Emily Rowling, who with Glenn wrote these Bible studies and has been working with you, Denise, and others to bring this project to fruition. So Emily, delighted to have you here with us, and really do want to know more about kind of this approach that you and Glenn took when you were looking at these studies, and how the approach that you took is different maybe than what people usually associate with Bible studies, or what you have been familiar with in terms of using the Bible in this sort of way. Can you tell us about that approach?
Yeah, thank you, Alex. So the way I came to understand this approach, I suppose, was through the use of the biblical text as literature, and through consideration of plot and narrative and character. So rather than using the text from the perspective of every question you've ever had, the Bible has a direct, cut and dried answer to it. Instead, acknowledging that so many of the deepest aspects of human experience can be found in this text. And so we can use it to reveal and to talk about some of those. I suppose another thing I found helpful was the idea of the application of lenses to aid these discussions, and to help us ask certain questions of the text. So obviously the lens that we applied in the creation of these studies was violence against women, domestic and sexual abuse. And I suppose that led us to questions like, what does this text tell us about power dynamics in relationships? What does it tell us about the ways in which victims of abuse might respond? And what does it say about the role of men in perpetrating or intervening against such abuse? And also more broadly, questions like, who is this story about? Whose voices are missing? And where do we go if we attempt to humanize some of these characters and fill in some of those blanks, hopefully in a way that goes beyond something like, how do you think the paralyzed man felt when Jesus healed him? Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it doesn't necessarily enable a deeper conversation or a deeper level of self-reflection and self-imagination, I suppose.
That's brilliant. And I'm just wondering, you have piloted this resource with a couple of groups and used this approach to kind of open up conversations. Have you been surprised by some of the richness of the text that have come up through those conversations, and things that you were glad to hear the resource helping people to articulate?
Yeah, absolutely. So each of these studies comes with a huge amount of questions, which hopefully will facilitate those kind of meaningful conversations that we're hoping that this will allow people to have. It was a real joy in one of the pilot studies to have about 5 or 6 questions prepared and to get through about 2 or 3 of them, just because of the kind of scope of the conversations that we ended up having. One quite brilliant example was, you will see that we have renamed the story that's traditionally known as the woman caught in adultery. We've renamed it to be the story of the woman who was almost stoned. And one of the questions that we asked in the course of one of the pilot studies was, can you think of other titles? What other titles might we explore? And one of the men that was engaging in the study said, what about the story of the woman who was caught in the crossfire? And I loved that response, because it places the woman right at the centre of the story without problematizing her. So I absolutely loved that. And I think we Glenn used to speak about using the text as a neutral third party. And I was always amazed at how he could move seamlessly from a conversation about an incredibly familiar Bible story to one about our own times and our own politics and our own communities. And obviously some of those can be really thorny issues. So there's something really powerful in the way that by talking about this, we're really talking about that. And that conversation then is kind of held and facilitated within a context and a framework that might feel more familiar to those of us who have been part of discussion groups and Bible studies in faith communities.
Yeah, thank you, Emily. And I'm just remembering in conversation, because I got to sit in on that pilot as well, and how this resource, among other things, opened my eyes, but also rekindled a love for biblical study. That it wasn't a Bible study that was obviously, oh, I know the answer, I know what people are going to take on this side or that side. It's actually something that's going to spark something new in me, including, and I'm hoping that one of the outcomes of this for church leaders in some churches is just to know that church leaders like me or other people, the goal here is not to provide the right answer for people who are looking for the right answer, but an opportunity to listen again and be a student again. And that was a great joy to be a part of that process. But I'm wondering about what aims you and Glenn had in mind when you were writing, and what you hoped this study and these studies would achieve with this project.
Yeah. So as we've already touched on, the intention of this resource as a whole is to equip churches to recognise, respond and refer onto agencies with the knowledge and the expertise to support women and men who find themselves victims of abuse. the hope of the studies within that is to facilitate, as I said, conversations about the underlying prejudices, thought processes and elements of culture, and particularly faith culture, which create the conditions in which discrimination and abuse can happen. So as an example, when at the outset of this, as we were thinking about the story of Hagar and Sarai and Abram, I mentioned to someone that we were using that story, and spoke a little bit about Hagar's experience, and someone said to me, don't you think there was a bit of her seeing an opportunity to advance herself and then taking it? Glenn used to talk about the ways in which the kind of questions we're inclined to ask reveal quite a lot about ourselves. So the hope too is that we might examine more closely those conclusions and the initial questions that we jump to, the initial conclusions that we reach, and that we think about the prior assumptions and prejudices that need to be unpicked.
Well, thank you, Emily. Again, just a joy to be able to hear that from you, and congratulations to you. Thank you, and Glenn and Denise, well done on bringing this before us so that churches can avail of this great resource and others can have this conversation that Emily and you have started. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Alex, and thank you, Emily, for leading us through this. I think it has most definitely set the scene for our keynote speaker. Just over 2 years ago, I received an email from Glenn Jordan, and the email had an attachment of a free downloadable book chapter from a newly released book. And that book was called The Bible Doesn't Tell Me So: Why You Don't Have to Submit to Domestic Abuse and Coercive Control. The author was described by Glenn as a brilliant academic and scholar, and he stated, you need to purchase this book for our project. I did, and it most definitely didn't disappoint. In fact, this book became the core reference and text, I guess, for our writings of the response guide. The author, Helen Pinter. And Helen is with us this morning, married with 3 daughters, starting her work life as a doctor, and was a kidney specialist by the time she was called out of medicine to train for the Baptist ministry. She is the author of several books, including the popular level books God of Violence Yesterday, God of Love Today. The book that I mentioned, The Bible Doesn't Tell Me So: Why You Don't Have to Submit to Domestic Abuse and Coercive Control. And at a more academic level, the relevant to the topic that Helen will be speaking into this morning, Telling Terror, Rape and Reparation for the Levite's Wife. So Helen, I am delighted to welcome you, and as Glenn described you, the brilliant scholar amongst this morning. So Helen, I'll hand over to you. You're very welcome.
Thank you so much. May I thank you very much for the for your warm introduction, which hasn't raised any expectations at all, of course, but also for the invitation to be part of this event. May I congratulate you for this fantastic resource, which I know God is going to use to do great things in the church. And may I bring greetings from the Centre for the Study of Bible and Violence, which I direct here at Bristol Baptist College. Can you see my screen all right? Is that working? Good. Well, this morning, I'd like us to spend a few minutes thinking about a very familiar story from the Bible, one that I think most people who are logged on today will know. But I'd like us to look at it through the lens of domestic abuse, of violence against women. And I'm going to intersperse it with some modern stories. I'm also going to use some contemporary and some classical art to explore it. This doesn't start off obviously as a story of domestic abuse. It begins in what some would consider a love story, a story of illicit love, admittedly, but well, we can move past that, can't we? This is actually the story of coercion and violence from the very start. And it begins with a powerful man looking out from his own property towards his neighbours. And what he sees there is a woman. I use the language of what rather than who, because that's exactly how this man thinks. In a similar story later on in the scriptures, another powerful man called Ahab looks out from his property and sees a thing that he wants. In that instance, it's a vineyard, and Ahab acquires it through dirty dealings and judicial murder. But on this occasion, the man in question isn't Ahab, the dodgy ruler of the northern nation, but David, the exemplary king of the united Israel, the one that everybody likes, admires, looks up to, the golden boy. And let's just pause the story there. Because this isn't a story that's taking place out there among the pagans. It's not the tale of an ancient Midianite act of exploitation or the story of a sordid Philistine affair. It's not about the Moabites or the Amalekites or the Jebusites or the Hivites. It's about Israel, God's own people. And it's not about a renegade Israelite, someone on the margins, someone who doesn't know better. This 15th century painting represents a story from 2 Samuel 6. Look at the king there, dancing before the ark, hand in hand with a priest. These events of our story are unfolding right at the very heart of the nation, in the city of Jerusalem, just a stone's throw from the tabernacle where the priests offer sacrifices and the ark of the Lord has its home. Here, at the very heart of the people of God, there is something rotten. It happened like that then, and it still happens like that today. Each of the quotations that I'll be showing you this morning are from actual women who experienced domestic abuse. Some of them are people I've interviewed myself. This was the story of someone I'll call Jenny. Her husband was a lay preacher in one of the mainstream denominations. He was popular, he was well-liked, and regarded within the church as a good man. And he abused Jenny for upwards of 30 years. It began as coercive control. He belittled her, he mocked her, he made her feel small, weak, ugly, and stupid. And then it became physical. He slapped her, he pulled her hair, he punched her. Finally, he raped her. And all the way through, he spiritually abused her, using the words of the Bible to manipulate her, to disparage her, and to trap her. Abuse happens in churches. It happens at the heart of the church. It is as common within churches as it is in wider society. Now, as then, even at the heart of God's people, there is often something rotten. So David looks out from his palace and sees something that he wants. It's a woman. He sees, he desires, he gets. He sees what he wants and he sends servants to fetch her. There's no gap between desire and possession. That's how it is if you're a king in ancient times. But here's the thing. What do you do if you're a king's subject in ancient times? What do you do if you want to keep your head, to avoid the dagger in the dark? You say, yes, sire. You come when you're sent for. You climb into bed if you're told to. You do whatever you're told to do, no matter how demeaning, how unpleasant, how wrong. Your opinion is irrelevant. Your conscience is irrelevant. Your likes and dislikes are irrelevant. Your pain or pleasure is irrelevant. Consent is a meaningless thing. Look at how Chagall has represented Bathsheba sitting at David's feet. She is trapped by two important consequences of David's power, his sense of entitlement and his objectification of her. The king has not had to delay his gratification for many years. His sense of entitlement has grown all-consuming. His soul has been eaten up by his own desires. And he has been surrounded by yes men for so long that he's forgotten that not everything is his to use. It happened like that then. It still happens like that today. Domestic abuse is a power phenomenon. Sometimes that power is obvious. It's a businessman, an MP, a professor, a church minister, an elder. Someone respected, wealthy, successful, someone that others look up to, admire, flatter. Sometimes the power is only seen at home. physical power, or financial power, or emotional. Sometimes spiritual power is employed. This is a quotation from an interview with someone who was abused in the home by a man who held a senior role in his church. He weaponized all his spiritual authority against her. He used the Bible to contain her, to subjugate her, to force her to comply. He claimed all the obedience of her discipleship. He blasphemously demanded from her what was due only to God. Now, as then, those with excessive power often become abusers. One thing that's often overlooked in this well-known story is its setting in a time of conflict. In fact, the two chapters which contain it are framed by references to a war with the Ammonites, particularly a city called Rabbah, represented here in the 13th century Crusader Bible. This is not a nation which is content with its own lot, but one which is striving to expand, to assert its own dominance, to grow in power. This forms the setting for what happens to Bathsheba. Why is this relevant? Well, first of all, because her husband is away from home. He is pursuing the war, leaving her at home unprotected. Conflicts create exceptional circumstances that put non-combatants at risk from their own side as well as at risk from the enemy. Conflicts brutalize people too. They train people to desensitize their conscience. They force people to do dreadful things, to harden their hearts against compassion. David was a man shaped by his many wars. He was such a successful warrior that the popular songs of the day celebrated him as a slayer of tens of thousands. The writer of Chronicles tells us that God would not permit him to build the temple because he was a man of blood. He was a man used to the slash and hack of battle, to carving his passions into human flesh. Why would we expect him to be gentle, tender, polite in his courtships? And the third consequence of war was that it marginalized domestic concerns. All national interest was focused on the front line. Everyone would be expected to make sacrifices for the greater endeavor. That included those at home. Women like Bathsheba, who experienced rape and abuse, would be expected to put up and shut up. There were more important things to worry about. And war provided the perfect cover story for more dirty deeds. In this instance, the murder of Bathsheba's husband, to leave her even more vulnerable to David's maneuvers. It was like that then. It's still like that today. Here's a quotation from a woman who experienced domestic abuse during the Troubles. The hierarchy of violence pushed certain evils into the spotlight and thrust others into the shadows. It created a set of exceptional circumstances where men were removed from their homes, training or in prison, leaving families vulnerable. It created a narrative of existential conflict that subordinated all other threats. It brutalized combatants who became hardened to the sight of blood, to broken bodies, whose consciences were scarred. Violence at home sometimes serves as a rehearsal ground for larger scale violent actions. The culture of the warrior breeds a violent hypermasculinity that does not feel the need for politeness or gentleness or consideration. This hasn't settled with the Good Friday Agreement. Here's a quotation from someone who works in a domestic abuse aid organisation. In this post-conflict situation, reported domestic abuse levels continue to rise year by year. What was tolerated in the exceptional situation has become structural in the post-conflict years. Gender-based discrimination and structures of power that subordinate women continue. Brutalized ex-combatants continue to brutalize others. Now, as then, the darkness of conflict has a wide and enduring penumbra. We return to Bathsheba. Objectified by a powerful man, taken without consent, impregnated and sent home, and now widowed by the ever-expanding violence and desire of her abuser. Where is she to turn for help? To whom can she protest? Well, the conventional way of obtaining justice in Bathsheba's day was to raise what was termed an outcry, to protest loudly and visibly. The outcry of the victim was an established procedure to mobilize the systems of law enforcement. It rallied the community to identify the crime, to try and punish the criminal, to address the woes of the victim. There was a legal system. And at the top of it sat the king. So where should Bathsheba voice her protest? Not to the king himself, that would be ridiculous and most likely fatal. To his advisors, to his henchmen, who will speak for her? Who would risk his own position and his own safety to voice a complaint to the king on behalf of this woman? And so she is voiceless, silenced, powerless to change her circumstances or even to protest them. The king is accountable to no one. It was like that then. It's still like that today. Here's a quotation from a woman who experienced domestic abuse within a church setting. This is no isolated incident. Again and again in my research, I've come across stories like this. All too often, churches operate with structures of power which prevent women from voicing their experiences. Sometimes that's because of hierarchical systems within church, patriarchal structures bolstered by a particular theology and particular scriptural interpretations. In my research, more than one woman told me that the church had groomed her to experience domestic abuse. It had taught her that women should be silent in church, that men were to have authority in the church and at home, that a woman's place was to be subservient and to obey. It's a small step from there to a would-be abuser exploiting that theology. And when he does so, when headship becomes domination, when obedience is enforced, when submission is to an abuser, not a loving husband, when he starts to overstep his God-given authority, if indeed it is given by God, the entire system is stacked against the woman. How can she complain when she is supposed to be silent? How can she protest when she is supposed to be meek? How can she stand up for herself when she is told that it is a Christian woman's privilege to suffer? But there are more layers yet, more ways that those who are experiencing the harm of domestic abuse are silenced in the church. Because when a woman does sum up the courage to disclose what is happening, she may still be silenced. Sometimes she's not believed. The abuser may be powerful, influential, have a good reputation. It must be a mistake. She must have done something to deserve it. We'll come back to that one in a minute. Sometimes the abuser is considered so important, so significant in the ministry of the church, such a great preacher, such a substantial donor, that his crimes need to go unaddressed, remain unreported, be covered over for the sake of the greater good. Sometimes the woman is told to forgive. And forgiveness means allowing the abuse to continue, doesn't it? It means returning to the home or allowing the abuser to return, allowing him to have unfettered access to his wife and children, to the family finances, to the marital bed, doesn't it? Now, as then, systems of power conspire to silence the abused. We'll return once more to Bathsheba, or rather to the interpretations of the Bathsheba story, because this image is one of many. It's representative of the many times in art, in poetry, in literature, in sermons, when Bathsheba has been represented as the femme fatale, the woman whose wiles entrapped David, the woman whose guile led her to bathe seductively beneath his window. It wasn't his fault at all, was it? He was powerless in the face of her beauty. Some commentators have gone even further and performed mental gymnastics to deny David's guilt at all. But all of this is to read something into the story that was never there. We are never told that Bathsheba was naked, that she bathed alluringly, that she planned to seduce the king. She may simply have been washing her feet or cleaning herself beneath her clothes, as many across the world still do today. And we notice that in the account of the divine judgment which follows, we'll come to that in a few moments, Bathsheba is not the target of God's condemnation. that is expressed entirely towards the king. But for thousands of artists and poets and commentators, it has suited their purpose to represent Bathsheba as deliberately seducing David, or at least half complicit in the crime which follows. This is victim blaming, pure and simple. It was like that then, still like that today. There are hundreds of ways in which women are blamed for the abuse that they receive. It suits the purpose of the abuser to give that narrative. And abusers across the world use this as their standard modus operandi. Look at what you made me do. It's your fault. If only you would be more compliant. And these narratives become internalized by many who experience abuse. If only I were a better wife, it must be my fault. But there's more. Because when a woman does find the courage to speak out about her abuse, she will often find herself blamed for it, or at least the target of speculation. Ruth Tucker quotes the colleague who was commentating on a man who had murdered his wife. I wonder if she was contentious, he said. Well, you have to wonder what she might have done. It takes two to tango, you know. Other women are asked directly, what did you do to provoke him? You need to examine your own conduct. Up and down the country and across the world, abused wives receive such counselling in churches. This is victim blaming. But there are still more layers. Because even when a woman's complaint of abuse is understood to be accurate, she is still often cast as a troublemaker. Why can't she just keep quiet and put up with it? She's causing disunity in the church. She's interfering with the important work of ministry. She's making a mountain out of a molehill. Now, as then, victims are blamed for the abuse they experience. We'll return again to the story of Bathsheba, or rather of David's wider family, because this incident is not isolated from the remainder of his life. It's not quarantined from his family. With his actions here, David sets a ball rolling which will continue to spin out of control in the generations that follow him. Here in this 17th century print, the story of Bathsheba is contained in the oval that you can see on the bottom left side of the image. In the whole art piece, the artist has portrayed the story of Bathsheba surrounded by a number of other stories from the life of David. But we'll just focus in on this one at the top right. Here, if you look carefully, in the background, you can see Amnon reclining on his bed. Amnon was David's son. And leaving his presence in the foreground, you can see a weeping woman. This is Tamar, Amnon's half-sister and David's daughter. Amnon conceived such lust for his own sister that he conspired to trap her and rape her. And when he had finished possessing her, he thrust her from his presence like a soiled rag. Where did Amnon learn such behaviour, I wonder? Where did he gain that sense of entitlement? Where did he learn to objectify people? How did he learn that the gap between desire and a possession could be completely collapsed? What made him think that he could act with impunity as a powerful man, the son of the king? David's actions had consequences well beyond the moment. We could continue the story of David and think about another son, Absalom. He kills Amnon for his crime and later rebels against David. During that civil war, for a short time, Absalom takes possession of David's palace in Jerusalem. And what does he do there to consolidate his power? He takes his father's concubines onto the roof of the palace and he rapes them there in front of the nation. Where did Absalom learn such behaviour, I wonder? Where did he gain that sense of entitlement? Where did he learn to objectify people? What made him imagine that he could act with impunity as a powerful man, the son of a king? Or we might think of another of David's sons, Solomon himself. Solomon, who possessed 1,000 wives and concubines. Where did he gain that sense of entitlement? Where did he learn to objectify people? How did he learn that the gap between desire and possession could be collapsed completely? What made him imagine that his power permitted him to act in such a way? You see, the harm caused by David's abuse extended far beyond his primary victim. It was like that then. It is still like that today. Children who experience abuse or who witness it become traumatized. Some will go on to become abusers themselves. Others will grow up with post-traumatic stress disorder, with a distrust of men, with a sense of fear. Others will grow up with an expectation that they too will become victims of domestic abuse, or with a distorted pattern of what a healthy marriage looks like. Now, as then, the damage that an abuser causes extends far beyond the harm they inflict upon their primary victim. We'll return to the story of Bathsheba once more, because something wonderful and unexpected happens in this story. We've spoken about systems which conspire to trap a victim of abuse, which prevent them from speaking out, which deny them justice. We've spoken about the fear wielded by an absolute king. But within David's court, there was one man of courage, one man, Nathan, who saw what was evil and could not be silent. One man who subordinated his own safety and his own convenience to the needs of an abused woman. One man who dared to speak truth to power. I wonder what sort of pushback he experienced from others within the system. You can't speak to him like that. It's just the way of kings. What's he done wrong? Bathsheba was his subject. Pipe down for your own safety. We're in a time of war. Exceptional things happen in times of conflict. It's not David's fault, it was that temptress. Maybe some of those voices were in Nathan's own head too. How much easier would it have been to look the other way, to silence the nagging conviction in his own heart? How much safer, how much more convenient. But stirred by God, Nathan was indeed a man of conviction and courage and honesty. He dared to speak truth to power. He dared to disrupt systems of power. He dared to utter what was unthinkable, to bring what was done in the dark into the light. There was one man like that then, and we can be like that today. We can be allies rather than indifferent bystanders. We can disrupt abusive systems. We can pull things from the darkness into the light. We can give voice to those who are silenced. We can choose to believe those who raise the outcry. We can defy the systems that give powerful people a sense of entitlement. We can call out their objectification of others. We can stand with the weak and the downtrodden. We can exercise solidarity and we can act transformatively. Systems of abuse and power which have continued for generations can stop here. And just like Nathan, we do not operate in our own strength. The living God who sees what is done in the dark, the living God who leans out of heaven to attend to the poor and the weak, the living God who stands in solidarity with the victim. This living God is the one who sends his spirit to stir and empower us as he stirred and empowered Nathan. Now, as then, God is calling his people to step up and speak out. Let's return one final time to the story of David, this rather sentimental Victorian painting. I couldn't find a better one. Let's remember that this is how he began his life, as a simple shepherd boy. David never wholly forgot where he had come from, and the biblical tradition of kingship, which established itself around him, never wholly forgot that David had been a shepherd. The model of the shepherd who protects his sheep, perhaps at great personal cost, was held up as a pattern for kingship in the Old Testament. The wicked kings were compared to shepherds who neglected their sheep, or worse, who exploited them. Of course, there has only ever been one truly good shepherd, one who did indeed lay down his life for the sheep. This gives us hope. It gives hope to those who have experienced abuse, because this is a shepherd who tenderly bears those who are struggling, who notices those who are failing to keep up, who binds up wounds and heals broken hearts. There is hope in this image too for abusers, because this good shepherd goes after the one who has wandered off, the one who has chosen to leave the way of godliness. The good shepherd will chase you down and seek to bring you back. The message of Scripture is a message of forgiveness to those who repent. And finally, this pattern of a good shepherd is the pattern for Christian leadership today. Those of us who have any sort of leadership responsibility in the church must take this seriously. We too must bind up wounds and heal broken hearts. We too must deal tenderly with the weak and the struggling. We too must seek to make churches a safe place. We too must chase down those who have left the path of godliness and call them back to repentance and forgiveness. The God who leans out of heaven to pay attention to the weak, the vulnerable, and the exploited is watching. Let us not fail him in our generation.
Wow, Helen, that was profound. What a profound piece of study. Wow, thank you. It was deeply thought-provoking. And I guess as I'm sitting here, there's many thoughts going through my head, and particularly, you know, I noted down, you know, historically thinking about how many of our church institutions throughout Ireland has failed continually to protect women and children at their most vulnerable. And we've also a stark lack of redress really into that legacy of gender-based violence from the conflict. So you have just really summed up effectively how and why we are still sitting with, I suppose, the second highest rates of femicide in Western Europe here in the small little corner of Northern Ireland. So thank you so much. You are deeply brilliant. Glenn was very right. So we will have opportunity to put questions to the panel. So what I would like to do now is just for everybody to take a little break, a little breather, maybe take 5-10 minutes. We're now at 1:15. So if we be back here by about 25 past sharp, we'll start. Because we do want to have some time for question and answers. Again, I just want to remind everybody as you go off and take some time out, if you have been affected by anything this morning, to seek out somebody who is a trusted person to talk to, or certainly contact the helpline in the area that you're in. And here at Northern Ireland, we'll be showing that on the slides after the webinar. So thank you. We'll see you back here in 10 minutes. Thank you.
Hi everyone, so welcome back. I hope you have all been able to grab a cup of tea and just take some time to get some headspace. Just before we hand over to Will to speak to us, I just wanted to read a quote that I absolutely love from a author called Dorothy L Sayers. This quote is taken from a lecture that she gave, I think, in 1938, and it was then collected into a set of lectures that was placed into a book called Are Women Human? She was one of the first women to receive a degree from Oxford University. Yeah, I just love this. So I'm gonna read this to you all as we begin this half of our session. Perhaps it is no wonder that the women were first at the cradle and last at the cross. They had never known a man like this man. There never has been such another. A prophet and teacher who never nagged at them, never flattered or coaxed or patronised, who never made arch jokes about them, never treated them either as the women, God help us, or the ladies, God bless them, who rebuked without querulousness and praised without condescension, who took their questions and arguments seriously, who never mapped out their sphere for them, never urged them to be feminine or jeered at them for being female, who had no axe to grind and no uneasy male dignity to defend, who took them as he found them and was completely unself-conscious. There is no act, no sermon, no parable in the whole gospel that borrows its pungency from female perversity. Nobody could possibly guess from the words and deeds of Jesus that there was anything funny about woman's nature.
Thank you, Emily. And welcome back, everyone. Seed of Sequoia seeks to lead a faith movement, I suppose, of compassion, of courage and of hope, whereby no one will be excluded because of gender discrimination and violence. And I suppose thinking about Corrymeela itself, Corrymeela was begun by women and men of courage. And it really struck me whenever Helen was speaking about the courage of Nathan. And I suppose that would be our hope, that we can begin to have women and men stand alongside together, hold spaces together where we can begin to be courageous and have dialogue and start to have a system that no longer tolerates domestic or sexual violence within our society. And I guess domestic and sexual violence is very much a men's issue. In fact, many would say it is a man's issue. So how can we begin to stand in solidarity and share spaces of faith and speak out and challenge discriminatory misconceptions, sexism and gender language that continues to condone the violence? This morning, or this afternoon now, we're into afternoon, we are delighted to have Will Moore alongside us to shine some more light into hopefully some of these issues. So Will is an Anglican writer and speaker. He's particularly interested in the areas of gender, masculinity, sexuality, violence, and how they intersect with Christianity and the Bible. He is also currently training for the priesthood in the Church of England at Westcott House, Cambridge. And he's got his first book ready to be published, focusing on toxic masculinity, the Bible, and our Christian faith. And it will be published with SCM Press in 2022. Will, it's a joy to have you here amongst us today, and we are intrigued to hear what you share into these intersections of masculinities, violence in the Bible. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise. It's wonderful to be here. I'm still a bit in awe of Helen's keynote. She set the standard high. I had the privilege, Helen was my tutor not many years ago, so it's lovely to be speaking alongside her today. Thank you for having me here. Thank you for letting me talk about masculinity, because it's so important in these conversations and so often overlooked. So hopefully we can have a good discussion and conversation about that. So as we approach the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, we are faced once again with the question of what we can do to tackle the epidemic that is violence against women. But more than that, how much is it an issue that requires the involvement of men in order for things to change? I want to take us on a brief journey through where we are currently in society in terms of our culture of toxic masculinity, its relation to sexual violence, what we might find in the Bible about all of this, and how the church can respond effectively on a macro and micro level, particularly in relation to the part that men have to play. As we will all know, after the death of Sarah Everard earlier this year, this resource being launched today, as well as so many other campaigns to continue to confront violence against women in the home and in wider society, are needed now more than ever. The response to Sarah Everard's murder meant that an opportunity arose to re-understand how we engage with men's violence against women, where we place the blame and where we target our energy for re-education and change. And yet, with the emergence of the Not All Men hashtag, it seemed that many men in the UK did not want to take responsibility for their part in that culture of violence against women, and therefore surely refused to want to enact any change. It's not only the perpetration of crimes themselves that needs to be addressed in this conversation, but it's also the pervading culture of misogynistic, hateful, and often simply unhelpful behaviour of men that needs to be completely overhauled. The cultures of toxic masculinity, patriarchy, and misogyny in which we exist are not just manifested in notable acts of physical and emotional violence, but also in discrete moments of social violence. whether that be in victim blaming, like Helen was talking about, in the objectification of women, in the unbelief of women's experiences, in the overlooking of and even amusement at harassment. For example, comments on women's bodies, their desirability, and what men would do to them, all considered banter way too often. They all create a space in which violence against women is normalised, can easily escalate, and therefore thrive. But simultaneously, the cultivation of such a culture can be seen as a much more subtle pollution of our world. Too often do we see little boys still being told not to cry, to get their dream girl, whatever that takes, to let out our anger in a sanctioned space, to be tough, and to always unfailingly be the best. We underestimate the impact that this has and carries on to have into the rest of people's lives. Such gender coding has set standards of masculinity which persist into adulthood. Men are still associated with sex, money, power, control, violence, emotional suppression, blamelessness. I think we can meet someone who we believe to be the nicest guy in the world, and they still will have been socialized into toxic masculinity in some way, in whatever way and to whatever extent they enact that. The defunct gendered socialization process that we continue to perpetuate has resulted in masculinity and toxicity becoming so intertwined that at this time they cannot be severed, which means all men have a part to play in this conversation. As an ordinand in the Church of England and as someone who is writing on all of this kind of stuff, this event today is an important one. First and foremost, all of us being here acknowledge this is an issue that the church and faith communities, as well as wider society, needs to address. It cannot hide in the shadows any longer. The violence that happens both in the hiddenness and even the openness of our lives and the lives of those around us must be exposed. But secondly, we acknowledge that this is an issue that faces members of our own faith communities too. Churches and religious institutions are not exempt from what is going on. If anything, we have a revolting history of complicity and even involvement in the enaction, perpetration and perpetuation of domestic and sexual violence. It is sadly right in front of us. And so being here means we acknowledge this. We put our hands up and say, right, as a society, as individuals, as communities, we've gone wrong and we've got to do something. But the manifestation of this action must have two streams. Firstly, we must be practically ready to take actions in terms of safeguarding, pastoral support, whistleblowing, amongst so many other responses. But secondly, and more often overlooked, we have to take action theologically. We cannot be practical about thinking and acting on the intersections of gender, violence, and scripture without letting it interrogate and shape our faiths and beliefs. How does the Bible speak about these issues? What does it have to tell us? Where is God in them? And where are we? The Bible can and has been used to justify almost everything under the sun, good and bad. It's a collection of holy text that I believe tells the story of the relationship between God and humanity, one of God's love and mercy and God's unfailing redemption of our brokenness. But it's a library of ancient texts set within context with original meanings, ideas and purposes that we will never fully understand. And yet they are texts that we can, should, and do resonate with as people of faith, as we bring and also find ourselves and our experiences in Scripture. It's a difficult line to tread, to find deep and personal significance in texts which should never be uprooted and removed entirely from their background and context. The Bible describes many examples of what we might consider to be domestic or sexual abuse and violence against women. And please note that although we're not talking about it today, that men are victims of sexual violence in society and even in the Bible too. But just a few examples, some of which Helen has already covered, but we'll briefly recap. In 2 Samuel 13, we see Tamar raped by her own half-brother after she explicitly says no. Not everyone is safe even in their own families. In Ezekiel 16, we see awful imagery of God and his wife Israel, depicting abuse within marriage as the unchallenged norm, as well as men's control over their wives' bodies. If we are to imitate God, surely we aren't to be like that. And of course, the story of David and Bathsheba, where King David, so often considered as one of the greatest men of the Bible, is not such the masculine idol that we have painted him to be. As we've heard, he invades Bathsheba's private space. He intercepts and takes her for his own without consent or question. He uses his power to get what he wants, even if she is married. And then when he finds out she is now pregnant too, protecting his masculine status, David goes as far as to murder one of his most loyal soldiers, Bathsheba's husband, just so he can take and abuse a woman in his own private space without questioning from the man who truly cares for her. David is toxic. He enacts so many awful traits that have traditionally become associated with manhood. He violates a woman, he abuses his power as king, he cares about himself, his pleasure, and his status over anything else. It truly is a troubling narrative that hasn't had enough attention with a critical lens, particularly in terms of masculinity. So I'm thankful for Helen, how she's engaged with that today. And so we can see that toxic masculinity and sexual violence against women is present, and I promise you is rife in the Bible, and still endures today in an entirely different time and context. And if we know little, if anything, has changed from biblical text to modern day, then we have to acknowledge that there is a universal problem and that men are in the center of it. Toxic masculinity is still one of the biggest underlying problems facing the globe today, infecting every aspect of our human lives. It has not spared anyone, at least in our modern Western societies. And if patriarchy, misogyny, and toxic masculinity infiltrate every aspect of our society, then it is undeniable that men as a whole, as a collective, are guilty. And yet men continue to wash their hands of such guilt. We have to open up and nurture a sense of self-awareness and accountability in men and how they navigate the world. In the Bible, men are so often the active agents who hold the power, whether that be as ancient social individuals, as literary characters, or even as authors, interpreters, and so much more. But sadly, we rarely see this active agency used in a positive way. It usually comes into play in the abuse of women, the abuse of authority, the abuse of status. But what would it mean as men of faith if we turned this active agency on its head and used our privilege for the better, to interrupt the incessant cycle of toxic masculine socialization in our society? Let's teach boys to be emotionally literate. Let's teach them to understand women's bodies and the boundaries consent around them, and to acknowledge that they don't need to be tough and strong in order to succeed. Just as Denise said at the start of our time together, many of us won't have heard a sermon addressed to women and to reassure them that there are places of safety to go and be. But I imagine there are even fewer of us who have heard a sermon addressed to men about their own parts, as well as how they can respond to violence against women and its wider culture. If we haven't heard it, might it be our job as men to preach it? If you don't hear these issues discussed enough in your own communities, as a man, then start the conversation. Use resources like this study being launched today and get people talking about how these issues intersect with the Bible and our faith. I will say it again, acting not only practically, but also theologically matters. If we don't interrogate these pieces of scripture properly in a public way, alongside the experiences of women today, then men won't see and understand the problem within them, and they won't realize the extent to which such a toxic culture is silently and subconsciously embedded deeply in our individual and societal psyches. Naivety and ignorance become silence and collusion. Lack of understanding becomes complicity to violence. It is the onus of men to talk to other men, to call them out when necessary, to speak out about gender equality and violence against women, and to help make this world a safe one where everyone can thrive. By saying this, I don't mean that men are given more power or importance by being put back in the centre, but I mean that we are recognising the influence and potential that men, particularly amongst other men, already have to enact cultural change. When we discuss these topics, masculinity does not need to be pushed to the side, but it does need to be addressed with due criticism and self-awareness. And so, where do we land with all of this? The task of challenging the deep roots of modern toxic masculinity, which leads so much to the violence against women, can feel like such a heavy burden and an impossible one. But we, the church, and more widely communities of faith, should be at the front of this issue, acting practically and theologically. Today, we only just begin to grapple with the extent to which these issues really can be considered to be an epidemic, not only in modern society, but in our churches, in our Bibles, in our history, everywhere. But by talking about it, we take the first steps to encounter the relationship between toxic masculinity and violence against women, and we commit ourselves to responding and doing more. We recognise the socially inherited part we have to play in this conversation as men, that we have to open our eyes to our own toxic traits and how we might change, and that we should be sent out to make sure that the response to men's violence against women must start with just that, the men. After all, many of us here today are Christians. We believe in Jesus Christ. And just as Jesus broke himself out from death into new life and invites us to do the same, we are called to break ourselves free from the shackles of gender oppression and toxic masculinity and the violence it entails, and reach into a new future of possibilities for what men can be. We find solidarity in the crucified Christ who suffered and knows the pain that humanity can bring to one another, and yet we find hope and transformation in the risen Christ and the empty cross. Perhaps we might crucify, at least conceptually, toxic masculinity once and for all, and resurrect modern masculinities to inhabit new, healthier forms of being a man, where bodies are sacred, where others are not abused, where violence does not thrive. Maybe that might be part of the gospel that we can share in our faith communities. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. That was really incredibly thought-provoking, and I guess for me, sitting here, it has given me such an encouraging message of hope, hearing a man speak into these issues. It's so rare And in my fairly long and many years of life, I probably have heard less than one hand a male speak into those issues with such honesty and with such wisdom and with courage, because I think what's emerging here is the need for courage to be able to find new platforms and new spaces to share spaces. So thank you so much. It's really profound, and it's really making me think around that women shouldn't need to be objects or something to be protected. It is something that we should have, that natural human right to be able to coexist together without needing to be protected. So well, thank you so much for everything that you have brought this morning. And I really do hope that has reached out to many, and particularly many of the men that potentially have and will listen to this webinar afterwards. Thank you. I suppose, like always with these situations, we run out of time. Time is always so very scarce. We are hoping to have questions and answers, but it may be something we need to do after 12 o'clock if panelists and people want to stay around, but that might not be a possibility. But as we are moving into the closing now of our presentations, I am delighted to welcome amongst us now also the brilliance and the magical Padraig Ó Tuama. Padraig is the former leader of Corrymeela and a world-renowned poet and theologian, and has been a joy to us in the midst of this project. And for me personally, has been a real avid anchor and supporter in difficult work. Working in these spaces is extremely challenging and complex. And as we know, when you've talked well into the intersections, as has Helen so much, people don't want to hear these messages. It's easier for people to keep it hidden and keep it silent, because then we don't have to believe it's happening. So this morning, or this afternoon, I just want to hand you now over to Padraig for his wisdom and creative genius. Padraig, thank you for coming in from New York at some ungodly hour of the morning. So thank you.
Thanks, Denise, and it's lovely to be with you all at the launch of this most important resource. I caught the end of Will's comments there, and I am really honoured to have been involved a little bit over the course of this, working alongside you, Denise, and Emily, and Alex, and others from Corrymeela, looking at what does it mean to let help actually be helpful. I think lots of people often want to say, oh God, I want to help. But there's always the critical question that needs to be asked about, is help helpful? I'd like to start off by using an anecdote from Rebecca Dudley, which might have been shared before. I'm sorry if it has. Rebecca Dudley, Dr. Rebecca Dudley, works now with the International Red Cross and has worked for many years in Belfast, and would regularly be asked, as a human rights expert, as a theologian, she would regularly be asked to speak at churches about the plight of human trafficking, particularly of women and girls, because churches were concerned about that. And Rebecca would say to the churches, I will come and do such a talk, but I will come and do 2 talks. The second talk will be about human trafficking, but the first talk will be about domestic violence happening within the congregation of your church. And she said she was never invited. She said she'd do it free, but they always dropped the invitation, because the idea of having a mission to go to, in a certain sense, to have a certain kind of story about what rescue meant, was more palatable and more possible in some congregations than the possibility of having to be a congregation that said, we know statistically that it is entirely linked between the statistics about this congregation and the wider community in terms of the percentage of people here in the congregation. It mirrors exactly the percentage of people outside congregations who are experiencing violence in the home. That is a difficult message for congregations to know. That is a difficult message for a congregation to have spoken from the front, but it is a necessary message. So much of this, I think, is part of, I think, perhaps an idolatrous understanding about what mission is. Mission is the same word from which the word mass comes, that you get in Anglican and Catholic circles. It means to go, and the implication of that is that always the community of Christianity has the message and you go into the wide world. And I think one of the things that's needed is a deeper undoing of the imagination of where we need to go. It is into the realms of our own violences as communities of people, to acknowledge that, to reflect that, and finding a way to understand that mission isn't about being a savior or a messiah to other people. It is about holding on to these most complex of terms that are at the heart, I think, of much religion: repentance, confession, change, truth-telling, self-disclosure, responding to the possibility of redemption, and serious culture change. These, I think, are some of the reasons why Jesus of Nazareth was so difficult to have as a friend, even if you liked him. And therefore, I think it should be of no surprise that the church should be a difficult companion when it comes to being brave to speaking out about the truth of violence within the context of ourselves. Help, I think, is always something that people will say they want to offer. But I too think that the context of mission is best understood in this way, knowing that help is sometimes saying, we're not the best place. I'll be your friend. I'll be your minister. I'll be your small group companion. I'll be somebody who'll text you regularly. But here's a group of people who can actually help, who have the resources and who have the privacy, and also who can help you distinguish between your life. Here's the congregation I might want to be part of for my whole life, and here might be the place where I'll need to rely on particular support for the next 9 months. The church trying to do all of that will probably mean that certain privacies and ways within which an individual does want to compartmentalize parts of their life, like we all do, that won't be possible if a church tries to be the everything. And so therefore, I really applaud the imagination behind this resource that isn't trying to say, here's how congregations can be the everything. It's just saying, here's how congregations can be true. And here's how congregations can know, where can I say is a good place for you to go? And how can I be helpful as a friend, as a minister, as a co-congregant, as in whatever way you can. I'm going to finish. I know we're coming up towards time, and I suppose I wrote a collect for this. I'm always interested in how it is that we can read the artistry of text and be present to the discomfort of that text. One of the things for any of us coming out of violence is knowing the profound isolation that comes when you live in violence, thinking nobody will believe me, or I'm the only one, or it'll stop soon, or this or that. I'm sure you've explored some of those dynamics. And I think what we need over and over is the deep possibility that the mission of belief is not in an abstract imagination of salvation, but in the deepest possibility of belief being tuned toward those people who have been told they are unbelievable. And within the context of congregations, it is people who are living with violence in a home that might be called Christian, who probably believe most profoundly that they are not believable. And I think it is a radical way to respond to the possibility of God by committing oneself to belief when anybody discloses anything, rather than placing the burden of proof on somebody who might have waited a year or 10 before they disclose even the beginning of this secret to somebody. And this, I think, is the possibility of responding to God in our midst, is to follow where the deepest need for belief takes us. And this, I think, can be a theological and interpersonal impulse that is of such need. So here's a collect. Jesus of the bleeding face, when you were hit, you asked the person hitting you why they hit you. You confronted them with their own violence. And when they justified themselves, you showed how hollow their justification was. We pray today for everyone living with violence, that they can be believed, supported, that they can find safety, that the help that comes their way can be actually helpful. We pray that the violent will stop being violent, because nobody deserves to live with violence anywhere. Amen.
Thank you so much, Patrick. Again, thank you for bringing another lens into our space this morning. It's been such a rich webinar. There's been such profound inputs, and it was our hope that at this stage we could potentially have a question and answer session, but I think that that is unfortunately not going to happen. What I will suggest, if anybody has any pressing questions for any of our speakers, if they could email them to the Seed of Sequoia email that's provided, and we can certainly see around getting some answers to any thoughts, reflections or questions that are emerging. So just tying it all together, I want to just remind you that the Seed of Sequoia resource website is now live. It's still a work in progress, and indeed we will have many tweaks. It literally just went live this morning, so there's probably a lot of edits and different things that we need to do. So please have patience with us. It's a reminder that we will be delivering this as a 68-week course in the new year. And again, just as Patrick spoke into, it's not a course to tell you how to do it, but it's opening up spaces that both Helen and Colette, Alex, Will, Emily all spoke into this morning about spaces of courage where we can begin to share a different dialogue and a different space. So please look into it. I think the website is on the cards at the end of the webinar. One of the key things that I do want to just draw to your attention is a gentle reminder into if there's anything that you've heard this morning has impacted you, or anybody that you would know, that you will seek out a trusted person to speak to, or certainly make contact with one of the 24/7 national helplines that's available. The Northern Ireland helpline will be presented at the end of this webinar also. And it's really a very confidential, it's free from a telephone line, and often it's just a really strong point of contact if you've been affected by anything that you've heard. So thank you. I'm going to hand over to Emily. We're going to conclude our webinar. Emily is going to finish off with a prayer, and it is our hope that you will go to a Seed of Sequoia and that we will all keep in touch. I know that you have registered and said that you may want further information, so we will send that to you. So on behalf of Corrymeela, Seed of Sequoia team, I just want to thank all of our speakers this morning. I want to thank Colette, I thank Alex and Emily, I thank Helen and Will and Padraig. Every one of you have brought such a deep and profound meaning and message to us this morning. So thank you.
Thank you so much to you, Denise, as well, for continuing to hold this project and see it through in difficult and painful circumstances sometimes. So thank you for all that you have done to see this through.
Thank you.
So this is a prayer taken from the book Daily Prayer with the Corrymeela Community. Surprising Son of God, you revealed the truth to women who were not believed by men. You are in the voices of the unbelieved and the ignored. So bring us towards each other. Bring us towards the truest truth, because here, if anywhere, will we find you. Amen. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for everybody who's attended this morning. Thank you.